Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ryan, and welcome to Central Park. We're so happy to continue bringing the park to you through not only our virtual tours held every Wednesday at 12:30 p.m., but also our in-person tours. Whether you can make it to the park in person or not, we of course want to continue helping to bring the park to you, and that's why we're continuing this weekly walk series. So thank you for joining us today on November 1st. 2023. Today, Wednesday at 12:30, we're going to be taking a weekly walk titled Great Trees of Central Park with me, Ryan. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us on our little 30-minute virtual tour segment, where we're going to be exploring different areas of the park and covering a lot of different themes. For those who have joined us before, you know our mission to keep Central Park clean and green by preserving Central Park as the sanctuary it is, enhancing the enjoyment of all, reducing those pressures of city life, and really giving us a lovely landscape to explore, especially during the fall season, which we're going to be exploring the park today. And as we do explore the park, we're not only going to see some wonderful photos taken by myself here in the park over the last few days, we're also going to get to see some pop-ups. Pop-ups including things like visitor polls that I'll launch throughout the tour today. Once everybody has voted in those, feel free to again, vote in those and I'll share the results and we'll see what everybody is thinking. As we do explore the park today, if you do have a question, please use the Q&A feature. My colleague Jose will be on the back end answering any questions you might have. Now, as we begin our tour today, we're going to start along the edge of a pretty familiar landscape up at about 100th Street in Central Park West, a location known as the Pool, one of our favorite areas to see a lot of beautiful trees, especially during this fall season. On today's tour, we are going to talk a little bit about what exactly is happening during the fall and what's producing so many of these beautiful colors that people come to the park to see. But we're also going to be exploring some of the park's great trees. And as we do that, we're going to cover a majority of the park's landscape, as we can see here from just a few of the territories we're going to be exploring today. But as we begin our walk, we'll start up on 100th Street and Central Park West, as we enter into a landscape known as the Pool, one of 7 water bodies we can find in Central Park today. Now we're going to be discussing trees, specifically great trees. Now, what exactly is a great tree? Well, New York City is home to millions of trees. In fact, let me start by launching a little poll that we can vote in here. And once I launch that poll, I'll share the results. So let's launch Tree NYC and take a moment to guess how many trees do you think approximately are growing throughout New York City? This is going to be on both public and private lands. But I'll let everybody vote in that. I will let you know it is home to millions, so that will give away one answer. But as you vote in that, we can take a moment to think about what exactly is a great tree. Now, millions of trees exist in New York City, but only few can really be considered great trees. In 1985, the city embarked on the first Great Tree Search, seeking nominations from citizens from each borough to basically just suggest different trees of unusual size, interesting species, and ones that have historical association, not necessarily just the biggest or the tallest trees. The heritage trees that were selected would help to best represent the diversity and the scale of New York City's urban forest. Since then, the city's embarked on a lot of other projects along the way, including the Million Trees Project, the genetic cataloging of a lot of old growth or large growth trees, and regular street tree surveys to catalog and recognize the incredible diversity of the trees of New York. Today, we're going to be seeing some of those great trees here in Central Park. We'll see 1 or 2 that was included on that Parks Department heritage list, but we're also going to check out a bunch of other species and individual trees that highlight just how great Central Park's trees are, including 1 or 2 of my personal favorites that are kind of secretive. But as we start our tour, I will end that poll and share the results. And it looks like a majority of you know approximately how many trees are in the city. We see the majority of people, 40%, guessing the right answer, which is 5 million plus. We see approximately, I believe, 5.2 million trees roughly existing in New York City right now. That's again on public and private land. But hopefully we'll see that number increase as there is a current initiative to plant more trees throughout New York City. Something that we can only achieve if a lot of private land agrees to plant some trees there. But as we make our way into the park today, we're going to be exploring the wonderful public lands of Central Park. And we can start by checking out a tree right nearby the entranceway to 100th Street. It's a beautiful species of beech tree. And as we stand under this beech tree, we can enjoy the fruits of this tree, literally, fruits that we probably won't see because they're desirable by a lot of wildlife. These trees produce beech nut seeds, which are rich in fat and protein, making them very desirable for a lot of squirrels and chipmunks. The leaves, which we can see are piling up on the ground here, often actually remain on the tree for quite some time for beech trees, well until the spring. During that time, new leaf growth often pushes them off. So if you're walking through the park in the winter and see a tree that is holding on to a lot of brown leaves, it's probably a beech tree, maybe one of the American or European that can be found throughout the park. There are a couple other interesting beech species and varieties, but all of them really do take a lot of care to preserve. There are various types of fungal and bark diseases, one being phytophthora. Phytophthora, a fancy word for this type of fungular disease that does affect a lot of beech trees, leading to every single beech tree in Central Park being treated with a fungicide throughout the early spring of each season. Bark and leaves of this tree, though, are certainly something special. They have been used by a lot of Native American tribes for their medicinal purposes, creating various types of teas or tonics from the leaves and stems can actually create a lot of medicinal teas that are good at treating ulcers, reducing inflammation, and treating things like dysentery. We're also seeing a lot of products found within this bark, also helping for digestive purposes. Creating a lot of these teas can really help to clean out your system. We do see these trees also serving purposes kind of like a bulletin board, sometimes being referred to as ancient bulletin boards because their smooth bark allow for a lot of messages to be carved in. Useful for Native Americans, but a little bit more damaging today as people typically inscribe initials and things that don't really need to be presented out to the public. It unfortunately also opens the trees up to disease. One of the reasons we have to be so diligent in caring for these trees each season. Again, about every April, you'll see every beech tree in the park getting sprayed. As we explore the park though today, we can enjoy some of the trees that are still holding onto their leaves, many of which are still producing some nice rich colors. As we walk by this beech tree, we can notice not only some of the beech tree leaves, but also some other tree leaves that are scattering along this landscape. And that's because as we look around, look up into the canopies, we can see a lot of towering trees here, including some of the park's most common oak trees. Walking a little bit closer to this towering giant, we can see the most common type of oak tree in Central Park, this being none other than a pin oak. The family Quercus, that's the Latin term for oaks, are one of the most common families in Central Park. Pin oaks are specifically the most common oak species you'll find in the park. And as of 2013, there was about 1,479 pin oaks documented throughout the park. And by 1,400, I mean at least 6 inches or more of a diameter on those trunks. So probably even more saplings beyond that. This tree is very popular, of course, because the acorn it does produce is a favorite fruit for a lot of wildlife. This is actually the second most common tree in the park, second only to black cherry trees, which are reported at being about over 3,700. But of course, oaks providing a lot of beauty in the landscape and a lot of function. And as we explore the park a little bit further now, we're going to talk about why trees are becoming so beautiful during this season. But let's take a little walk and make our way over to North Meadow before we do that. As we continue walking along the park, we're covering a big distance today, but we're going to see a lot of wonderful trees along the way. As we make our way over to this location, we can enjoy what exactly is happening during the season, a process called abscission. Now, during the winter months, deciduous trees or trees that lose their leaves begin entering a dormancy-like state for the winter, this process being known as abscission. During this time, a tree is going to go through a lot of cellular changes, and we can see a few trees scattered throughout the North Meadow landscape engaging in this process. As the trees enter this process, they're going to go through cellular changes that involve sugar concentration, dehydration, and cellular reconfiguration that basically make the cells glass-like and reduce damage from freezing in the winter months. During that time, trees are also halting the production of chlorophyll, that green substance that aids a tree in producing sugar or food, converting sunlight into sugar using chlorophyll. we see that green substance dissipating and start to basically emerge a lot of beautiful colors, reds, yellows, oranges, sometimes even purples and blues can be found. And these are coming from minerals and nutrients that are often found within the leaf present year long. Some of those are being produced in the fall season in preparation for the winter. But a lot of the colors are there year long and just covered up by that green chlorophyll. As that color dissipates, we're seeing a lot of these beautiful minerals and nutrients showing all of these rich colors, including some of the oranges and reddy colors we can see here, coming from some of these sugar maple trees. North Meadow, the landscape we're presently walking through, in my opinion, has some of the best sugar maples in the entirety of Central Park. The colors produced from these are remarkable. And sugar maples are the state tree of New York. The photo we can see here shows the leaves being a little bit lighter in color, but trust me, these are about as bright as they get in the park. A nice orange color coming from that state tree of New York, the sugar maple. No surprise that sugar maple does have high sugar concentrations in its sap, which is why it's typically the most common maple tree used for maple syrup. But any maple tree can be used to make maple syrup. As we explore this area, we can stop and take a look at one of the leaves, getting a little bit better of a sense of the bright color coming from this. And this bright colored leaf might look familiar. Some people often think this is the leaf used for the New York City Parks Department logo. However, it's not. You can see some similarities as I go back to that leaf and then back to the New York City Parks Department logo. It might have been a partial inspiration, but in just a little bit, we're going to see a tree that most likely inspired this logo. For now, though, let's continue on and make our way to that tree. As we leave behind those sugar maples, we can make our way a little bit further into the park, walking to the northeast corner of the reservoir and enjoying some of the beautiful foliage along the way. Coming up here, we can see how beautiful colors pop up in some of the maybe less or least likely places, like this small little curve wrapping around the east side drive. Over here, we can see oranges, yellows, and reds coming from the flavonoids, anthocyanins, and carotenoids that produce these colors. We see typically reds being the most common, being produced from carotenoids, which make up about 15 to 30% of the color present during this fall season. But a lot of beauty can be found over in odd and interesting areas of the park. I think actually one of the most beautiful sections of foliage I encountered on our walk today was along the transverse road over here. Behind this fence, bordering a road that's bringing buses and taxis and commuter traffic through the park, you can find some beautiful color there. Must be a nice treat for people that are passing by on their commutes through the city and getting to see a little bit of color spill over from the park. But it just reminds you that visit some of the less descript areas. Maybe those lesser traveled paths might bring you to some of the most beautiful sights you can find in the park. As we continue up, we're going to make our way to the bridle path, or a path once used for horseback riding, to see one of the most large growing trees found in Central Park. This is arguably the tallest tree that we have in Central Park. It's one that's very familiar to us and one that we can note because of a lot of the colorful bark produced from this tree. We can see an example of the large tree on the left, but a smaller version of it on the right. Although they do look a little bit different, both of these trees are the same species, London plane trees. Trees that are pretty identifiable from their more camouflage, peeling, chipping type of bark. The basic explanation for why their bark looks like this is basically an unusual adaptation. The bark has a lack of elasticity on this tree, so it can't expand as rapidly as the tree on the inside wants to grow and does. We do see the peeling bark, though, do having a lot of benefits for this tree. It actually eliminates a lot of harmful insects, parasites, or other maybe like egg sacs and things that might form on this tree. So it's really helpful in a way. And it also adds a lot of interesting color to us, to our views of the park. The original London plane tree, as you might have imagined, was discovered over in London, probably by somebody named John Trendescent the Younger. John Trendescent the Younger was a mid-17th century botanist who operated a London garden. He was an avid plant collector and a botanist, and a prime example of the English aristocracy's long-standing fascination with a lot of just exotic, interesting plants. He owned an oriental plane tree, which is half of what a London plane tree is. And we see him owning this in a garden, but eventually importing a newly popular American sycamore tree. Planting this nearby, a natural hybridization would occur of that oriental plane and the American sycamore, leading to the product we know today very well, the London plane tree. It quickly demonstrated a great tolerance for some of the rather grimy streets of London, really taking on a lot of urban impacts that were thrown at this tree, making it very, very heavily planted throughout the British Isles, Europe, and finally North America. We see the London plane tree today able to withstand a whole lot, including this mega specimen we see bordering the northeast corner of the reservoir. A lot of these trees squeezing out of asphalt, concrete, or random areas throughout the city, but when left in a park like this, able to truly thrive and get massive in size. Even when fully grown in size, they're still remarkable in the small space they can take up. Often they really are pruned within an inch of life as they're cut down to avoid telephone pole wires, buildings, and other things like that. But we also see them taking a lot of runoff, a lot of fertilizer from animals that might be utilizing the small patches of green or grass in which they're growing on city streets. They can also take runoff from the roads, a lot of salt during the winter, making this tree really able to survive just about anything that the city can throw at it. In 2015, a census conducted by New York City Parks Department, specifically documenting tree species or trees growing on streets in New York City, found that roughly 15% of all New York City street trees were London planes. It is one of the reasons we see this tree being not really planted anymore today, because it's found in such a high number. But the tree we see here is an incredible tree. It is, I believe, about 160 feet or so in height. However, I might be a little wrong with that. We do know for sure, though, its width around the trunk is roughly about 16 to 18 feet, but an incredible, massive specimen. One of the trees that we think may be a tree planted during the park's construction between 1858 and 1873. This tree has also been used by various types of genetic research or cataloging. As I mentioned before, many of the great trees of New York being cataloged or having their genetics taken through the use of pruning and through the use of grafting, allowing for these genetics to be passed on and really transferred to the future generation of planes that will be planted throughout the world. This tree, of course, standing the test of time and showing some of its historic roots holding it in. As we explore this area, we can marvel in this beautiful and especially light-colored London plane tree. The color we see here being typically more common for American sycamores, but again, sometimes a little variation occurs. As we leave behind this London plane tree, we can certainly find more throughout the park. We'll take a moment to appreciate a different type of tree, one that's certainly very historic and beloved by all. And as we make our way to Engineers Gate over at about 96th Street and 5th Avenue, we come to a very recognizable tree, a tree that is on the Central Park, or rather on the Parks Department Great Trees of Central Park list. This one in particular being an incredible elm tree that has certainly been left to expand and widen out, giving us a great shade tree, but also a fantastic specimen to look at as we enter this area of the park. And we think of elm trees, many of us probably think of the mall. The elms that line Central Park's mall are historic, and there's a good reason we probably think of those. They're actually home to some of the largest remaining strands of elm trees that are left in all of North America. So very historic strands that we have there. Elms tend to have really shallow root systems, and they're easily stressed or even damaged by soil compaction. That's one of the many reasons that elm trees throughout the park are fenced in like this one, including those that are along the mall as well. We do thank you again for helping us to keep these elms and these living treasures preserved by not hopping over those fences, not compacting the soil. And seeing over 42 million visits of people to the park each year, there's a lot of risk that these elm trees run. So remember, just because a tree is big and looks very massive, it's still very sensitive, and it can very easily be hurt by something as small as one of us. So let's be sure to preserve these beautiful trees, including this one that we see here. Trees, of course, like this one, are pretty rare nowadays because of Dutch elm disease, a devastating fungus-based disease that was spread by bark beetles and decimated a large number of elms worldwide. In addition, today, we do not only care for all these trees, regularly treating them, but also plant a lot of elm cultivars that are resistant to the disease whenever it's possible. But here we're seeing a more traditional, what is likely an English elm. Hard to say for sure. English elms typically have more burls on them, while American elms tend to have more twisted, kind of curling branches up top. It is very difficult to ID though, so don't beat yourself up if you can't tell if it's an English or American elm. Either way, they're still beautiful. What we can see here though is certainly a really beautiful twisting curving tree, one that has a lot of burls or little kind of bumps on it. I'll explain in a little bit what burls are, but one way we can estimate or assume this might be an English elm. Certainly a beautiful one though that provides a lot of shade, and one that's kind of welcomed us into the park here today, as this is actually a location that will be passed by from part of the New York City Marathon that will be occurring this Sunday, passing through all 5 boroughs, but ending here in Central Park. As we exit this area today, we're going to make our way a little south. We'll actually pass by the marathon finish line in just a little bit. But for now, we're going to keep walking, making our way past that long stretch of the reservoir and heading our way down to a maybe a more familiar landscape. As we come down, we pass by the lower portion of the reservoir or the northern portion of the Great Lawn. Over on the northwestern corner, we can pass by an area that we give an honorable shout out to, none other than the Arthur Ross Pinetum. The Arthur Ross Pinetum is an arboretum of roughly 17 species of pine trees. Began around the late 1970s and continuing throughout the decades. This area today supports a bountiful amount of evergreen trees, all pine species, and ones that provide beautiful scents and views during the winter months that are ahead. This area is great because it helps to represent many of the once great evergreen trees that existed throughout New York and Central Park. New York once having large eastern white pine trees, many of which were felled throughout colonialism eras, especially in the 1700s, as these trees would be felled and shipped back to England to be used for masts for naval vessels. We do see today very few evergreen trees existing throughout Manhattan, largely because of the industrial changes that have made it very difficult for evergreen trees to grow in New York City. But the Arthur Ross Pinetum carries along the tradition of the once bountiful collection of evergreen trees found throughout New York City. As we continue down south, we'll visit another particular tree, one that I don't think many people know of, but one of the most, I think, incredible stories for a tree. As we make our way down, we're going to come to a familiar landscape, one that I'm sure everybody has at least heard of, if not visited in person. It is none other than strawberry fields. As we make our way to strawberry fields on this overcast and a little drizzly day, we can enjoy the beauty of this little landscape, a landscape that's planted with a diverse collection of trees, as this is a garden of peace. And although we ultimately a lot of times think of that gray and white mosaic that graces the center of 2 of the pathways throughout here, the main purpose of the garden is to get lost amongst the various plants that were donated from various nations across the world, all of which supported Yoko Ono and John's message in creating a sanctuary for peace. This garden of peace here has a lot of plants throughout it. And while we're here, we can see some of the foliage, but that's not why we stopped here. We came here to check out a particular tree, one that might not be going through a big foliage change right now, but a tree we can see in the center of this picture. It is a type of oak tree, fittingly for John, an English oak tree. Now, this oak tree was planted on October 9th, 1998, and it actually has a lot of special and interesting meaning behind it. It's a tree I think many people pass by and don't understand its really storied nature. What we see here is a tree that was planted again on October 9th, 1998, October 9th being John Lennon's birthday. This was organized by the Liverpool City Council, and the event helped to commemorate the common bond between New York City, John Lennon's adopted home, and Liverpool, England, John's birthplace. The tree was planted as a reminder that John, like this tree, had set down roots in New York, forever binding the 2 cities together. We see in this photo, from left to right, Deputy Mayor Rudy Washington, Shayla Johnston of Liverpool, Parks Commissioner Henry Stern, Yoko Ono, of course, and Lord Mayor Herbert E. Harrity of Liverpool. We see this planting being a very historic one, not only being done to commemorate the bond between these two cities, but also helping to commemorate a first date shared by John and Yoko. The letter that we see here would be published in New York Times and few other New York City papers. This was put out prior to the creation of Strawberry Fields, and it was when Yoko Ono was really deciding how to commemorate John Lennon, writing out this call to arms to suggest that people donate trees here, trees that could be used to create a garden of peace. And the reason she thought to do this was relating to an early date shared by her and John, their first date to be specific. During this date, you can actually notice on the right-hand snippet how Yoko mentions the idea of how it came. She says, "Then I remembered what John and I did when we first met over 10 years ago. We planted an acorn in England as a symbol of our love. We then sent acorns to all the heads of state around the world, inviting them to do the same. Many responded, saying that they enjoyed the experience. Thinking back to this is what encouraged Yoko to help create the Garden of Peace we know today as Strawberry Fields. And this particular date experience would help to inspire the English oak that would be planted in 1998. That oak today, growing a lot larger than it has when it was planted a little over about 10 or 15 years ago, today creating a little bit more of a peace sign, very appropriate for John as it sticks out into the sky and gives us that reminder that this is a garden of peace, one that is supported by all the wonderful plant life found throughout here. As we exit Strawberry Fields, we're going to take a quick look at just a few more trees as we come to the end of our tour today. Walking a little bit along 72nd Street to the east, we can make our way to a tree that I have to talk about. It might not be on the great trees list of Central Park, but it is a great tree for us here at the Conservancy. It's a catalpa tree, but one that specifically is featuring a really incredible addition to it. What we're seeing here is a burl. A burl, B-U-R-L, is a strange looking collection of tree cells. It's often called a callus tissue, but a burl is a common name for it. Normally, these callus tissues are formed by a tree in response to an environmental injury, such as pruning, disease, or insect damage. In forest settings, it might be caused by storm damage, maybe shifting of water, organic materials affecting the coverage around the trunk and leading to an interesting growth or part being eroded away. We can find many different reasons for this, but even considering the general way trees seal off pruning cuts, that's typically what a callus tissue is. But these types of burls are often prized by woodworkers for their really interesting looks. In fact, in California, those who are attending from California are surely familiar with redwoods. A lot of the redwood sequoia trees are the main trees harvested for burls because woodworkers love the swirled patterns they create. This target burl, though, not only is a thing of beauty, it also provides something interesting, an interesting use. Do you see that? Let's look a little closer. You see that now? Let's look even a little closer. You might notice a little bit of gray popping up over there. That little bit of gray that we can see though this photo is likely the tail of a squirrel or maybe a raccoon, utilizing this really beautiful looking burl as maybe a little apartment. Certainly some prime real estate as we see just over here at 72nd Street near Bethesda Terrace. We'll let this squirrel sleep as we make our way a little bit further throughout the park, continuing past Cherry Hill and making our way to the marathon finish line a little bit south of here. As we pass by this area, we can take a quick moment to appreciate the construction occurring here, but also, again, the finish line for the New York City Marathon, which will be occurring this Sunday. I believe it's November 5th, it is, I believe 5th or 6th. This Sunday, the New York City Marathon, certainly a really interesting event, certainly something you can either watch in person or on TV. As we stop by this area, though, we can take a moment to peek out over Sheep Meadow, which of course is a little closed during this rainy time. But as we look out over the empty meadow, we can see a lot of large growing shade trees. A lot of the trees pictured on the far end of this picture are pin oaks, much like the tree we saw early on in our tour, one of the more common trees found in the park. But I want to look at a different oak tree. The oak we can see here is growing really widespread, much like that English elm we saw at Engineers Gate. This is a sawtooth oak. Sawtooth oaks are really cool. They are actually native to China, Tibet, Korea, Japan, and the Indochina area, as well as the Himalayas. Today, this is a naturalized species throughout North America, though. Naturalized species being one that's not native to an area, but doesn't pose a risk to native species like invasive species might. Um, this species is planted a lot of times throughout North America because it has higher acorn yields, meaning more food for a lot of wildlife. We do see that yield, though, not always going to good use as the acorns are a little bit more bitter, so they don't get prized as often as some of the other acorns found in the park do. But of course, they do provide a lot of beauty and shade to this area. For those visiting Sheep Meadow, this may be a favorite tree for a lot of people, especially on a hot summer day. And you can find about 2 or possibly 3 sawtooth oak trees growing throughout Sheep Meadow. My favorite, though, being the one found on that northwest corner. As we make our way down, we're going to visit one last tree or one last tree species. As we visit this last one, I want to visit a very special tree for me. It is certainly one of, I think, Central Park's greatest trees. And it is technically going to be 2 trees, but we're going to stop by and see the first one here. This is a tree native to South Central United States, not really native up here, part of the mulberry family, and one that doesn't really get that big. It's roughly 30 to 50 feet in height at its maturity, about 8 to 15 meters. It produces a nice kind of orange colored bark, which is one way you might be able to identify it. But I think the main way people will identify it is probably by the fruits it produces. It produces a multi-fruit or kind of multiple clusters of fruits that are growing out of flowers that are in a cluster, creating that brainy looking like giant grapefruit. What we're seeing there, though, it's more of a fibrous type of multi-fruit, one that's often called mock oranges or hedge apples, but is more closely related to kind of like a woody, pulpy type of fruit. It does secrete a stickier kind of white latex material that you can kind of see on the inside of this opened hedge apple. And because of that, it's kind of comparable to milkweed and it's not as desirable by a lot of wildlife. The fruit is typically not eaten by humans or wildlife. It does sometimes produce or reduce certain types of infestations, though, like rodents, sometimes cockroaches, I hear. So there is one benefit to that fruit that might not be getting eaten. We actually see this probably being a fruit or plant that grew with other large animals that are no longer existent, considering that most animals that exist today don't utilize or eat this fruit, meaning it probably has a hard time of producing or spreading when it's not cultivated or planted purposely by people. What we can see here is an Osage orange tree. Osage orange trees are absolutely beautiful. They are small growing trees, but they do create some nice hardy woody trunks. And this one is going through some nice foliage. But if we take a quick moment, we can walk south and we can walk to the very last tree we're going to see today. Might not be going through that much of a foliage change, and it might look small compared to the other trees found around it. But what we're seeing here is a really amazing tree. It's another example of an Osage orange. These trees do typically produce a thorn, and they have had a lot of uses, even though their fruits haven't regularly been eaten. They do produce a thorn on them. And throughout a lot of times, these plants would be manipulated to create walls and fences. The thorns would help to keep livestock fenced in or out of certain structures or areas. And it would also be really easy to manipulate, really changing the young growing shoots to kind of form a wall or form a hedge in the shape you desire. This was actually heavily used throughout North America until the invention of barbed wire in 1874, during which time this tree began to be planted less and less and used less and less for that purpose. But we do see it serving a lot of purpose throughout really historical times. Beyond being used as a fence, we can see this hardy wood being used by a lot of native tribes for bow making. This tree has a lot of uses, like we learned with the beech, a lot of medicinal uses that can be made from its various materials, but also really just we can consider the history of this tree. While it's been used to protect livestock or fence them in, it's been used to create hunting and foraging weapons, can even be used to creep away rodents and insects. What we can most appreciate with this particular tree is its age. Now, we saw some pretty big trees today, including that London plane tree. However, the tree you're currently seeing is arguably the oldest tree you'll find in Central Park. This is a tree that is largely confirmed to be a tree planted during Central Park's construction between 1858 and 1873. Those familiar with park trees know that there are really no trees that existed here prior to the park's construction. Some, probably a handful or two of trees that exist in the park today, were likely put up during that 15-year period. This being one of the ones that is almost 100% guaranteed. So while it might not look like that big of a tree, this is one of the most historic and greatest trees of all in Central Park. It's a good ending tree because it reminds us that don't always judge a book or a tree by its size. One of the largest and oldest trees ever discovered in Central Park that naturally felled was about 145 years. It was found about, I believe, 10 years or so ago. And that tree was about the size of a dinner plate. So just because a tree is massive, big trunked, or tall does not mean it's one of the greatest trees in Central Park. And this Osage orange is proof. As we come to the end of our tour, we can enjoy all of the beauty we find in the park, whether it be a great historic tree or one that's just providing us some seasonal beauty to enjoy. But even during the winter months, trees become even more, not even more beautiful, but I guess that's an opinion, still show a lot of beauty as we get to see many of those silhouettes from these deciduous trees. So I encourage you to come into the park, enjoy the remaining foliage, and seek out some of the park's great trees. And next time a call for great trees is put out, maybe you can suggest the city's next great tree. As we come to the end of our tour today, I will just launch a little last minute poll that you can vote in if you would like. And as we wrap up, I will just again leave our room open for any last minute questions we might have. So I'm trying to launch that poll, but as we come to the end of our walk, I'll try to get that poll launched. And again, we'll leave this room up for a little bit longer for any of those who might have last minute questions. But as we wrap up, I want to thank you again for your time today, for learning a little bit about the great trees of Central Park. From all of us here at the Central Park Conservancy, stay safe, be well, and we'll see you soon. Take care, everybody.